Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Real pleasure of mine to introduce you tonight to Sabine Matheson. Sabine Matheson is a partner and general counsel at Strategy Corp, which is a very influential strategy organization in downtown Toronto. It is my pleasure to meet Sabine because I've really admired Sabine, your involvement in politics and strategy over the years. And so thank you very much. I want to chat with you about a couple of those different issues if we could as we go. But I was at the Urban Land Institute Meet the Chief Planners dinner a couple of weeks ago, and you were the moderator of a panel discussion with some chief planners that was really quite interesting. Some people from Toronto, from York, from Markham, from Hamilton, and it was a really interesting discussion that you led and questions that you posed about what's going wrong with the housing file in the Greater Toronto Area and frankly across Ontario and Canada today. And so I wanted to focus in on that with you if I could. You've got, I think, an interesting background given that you've been with a Strategy Corp for quite a long time, but you were also in politics back in the 1990s and were chief of staff to a cabinet minister at the time. So I think that you've got a great background that is relevant here. Thank you for attending the show. What do you think came out of that dinner?
Well, thanks, Brian. I mean, it's funny because the theme of the dinner is bringing together the complexity of the development industry, and so if Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, it's kind of true of the dinner because it brings together about 30 or so land use planners who are the chief planning officials for their various municipalities. And that in itself almost sounds like a laugh line, right? I mean, we got 30 different chief planners in the GTHA. I mean, what could possibly go wrong when you've got such a diversity of people trying to implement it? But there's a reason for the fact that we have so many planners, and it's that, frankly, anytime you try and do something at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs that purports to work everywhere, it's doomed to fail. And one of the biggest challenges that planners at the ministry have is dealing with the diversity of our communities. Because what you need in a old established community that's talking about intensification and probably growing up in height and density is inevitably going to be different from a suburban community and different still from an urban fringe community and different still from a rural community. So that's one diversity. And then there's the diversity of all the builders who are in the room, who range from sort of greenfield, low-rise, single-family, traditional, white picket fence kind of stuff out in the suburbs where I grew up, all the way to tall buildings, and tall buildings are a lot taller now than they used to be. And thinking about how we can achieve the densities we want in these hugely dense communities. And then, representatives from the government, and then all the professionals who serve them, like the private practice planners, the private practice lawyers. And so the really interesting thing about the dinner is how it is a snapshot of this ecology of different interests. I should have also mentioned financiers, because of course the people who provide the capital to get all this stuff done are really important too. And I made a joke at the start of it that the guy who was the organizer, a really great professional named Richard Joy, who's the head of the Urban Land Institute, I told an imaginary story about him telling me that he wanted me to be the chair of this thing, but he wanted me to make it fun. And I said, well, I can talk about land use planning and housing in Central Canada, but I can't make it fun because like you said, we're talking a lot about the problems. And it's funny that it came across that we were talking about the problems because the question that I initially asked was, 10 years from now, if we're not going to be complaining about how it's just as bad, what will we have done to get there? And so we actually tried to look at the positive side of it, the glass half full side. And yet I don't quarrel with your characterization of it, because it was a lot of it still sort of felt like we've got to stop doing this badly and start doing it well. And so that broadly speaking, when these folks who represent the pinnacle of their profession came together to be asked, what would we be doing better? Well, I think it came under several headings. One is we'd make sure that we look after the affordability question. We cannot fail to look after the diversity of the needs of the people we need to serve. And the second thing I think that broadly came out of it was we just have to continue to get more efficient. It just can't take so long. And then I think the third big thing was that we really have to address infrastructure, because you can fight all you want about whether this building should be built here, but if you can't get water and sewer and electricity to it, there's no point in really having the conversation. And it seems like every time you turn around, you have to add another zero to how much those programs are going to cost. And so then you see the interrelationship between how long all the process takes and the underlying fundamentals of that, how you want it to be affordable, but how darn expensive it is. And then when you overlay the other thing, which is, if you think about it, I remember Donald Rumsfeld talking about, known unknowns and known and unknown unknowns. Yeah, and so you try and say, okay, well, we're going to control our own destiny and we're going to move forward as best as we can, and then all of a sudden you say, oh yeah, unless the economy goes into the toilet. And so, like we are all slaves to questions that are bigger than us in terms of policies that are influential, like, well, we think we're building housing for this many people, but immigration policy could change. Or we think we're building affordabilities for an average economic level of ability to afford or to pay. But, that's assuming like current levels of unemployment as opposed to what, you and I are both old enough to have lived through 11% unemployment as opposed to, 5s or 6s where we've been lucky enough to be in recent years. Or interest rates, I'm old enough to remember 14% or 17%, I think, briefly. And of course, I've also been at as close to zero as possible. So all of those things came up in this conversation, but the three themes were definitely continued process improvement, which you'd like to be able to think you could take for granted, continued focus on affordability, and the real challenge now of managing infrastructure. And I think then it got to, so what kind of policies do we have to have in place to encourage that kind of thing? So it was a great conversation.
I thought it was a good conversation. I think you did a great job moderating it. So thank you. Let me talk to start with about your issue in regards to process, because it was interesting because there was a difference, a little bit of a difference of a point of view on the stage where the planner for Markham was talking about how bad the red tape regulation and time was to get approvals. And he talked about the levels that, you had to go to the city of Markham, then the region of York, and then off into the province of Ontario. And he really focused on the regulatory burden. And then the planner from Toronto was almost saying, but too many of you try to go around the process, stick with the established process, come in the front door. What did you think about that conversation?
Well, it's what's significant about it is there's truth on both sides, right? When you're empathetic to planners, what they would say is, look, I have an approval process that's been imposed upon me. I didn't make it up. It's a process where it's like a car wash. You drive up to the front and you get dragged through the process. And, they would say at a car wash, there's certain things you got to do. You got to put your car into neutral and you got to roll up the windows, turn off the ignition. And, I think they sometimes think that some clients come to the process without reading the note about rolling up the windows first. And so, what's that mean? You come with something that they can't possibly approve because your model of planning in your own mind is a negotiation model. I'm going to ask for as much as I can because I know I'm going to get whittled down. And so you create this kind of haggling effect within it. Or perhaps it's something more mechanical than that. You don't come with the appropriate reports. So of course they have to send you back. And so somewhere between the chaos of politics, the requirements of the bureaucracy, bureaucracy, when well done, is our public administration process, and when it's badly done, it's just red tape. And I think what she was saying was, if you don't come ready to go, then you're actually creating your own red tape. Now, the dude from Markham, who's a great planner, what he was saying is, yeah, you know what, we could probably do some structural streamlines so that that car wash is a 5-minute car wash, not an hour-long car wash. And so what's that look like? That looks like continuing to streamline approvals, processes. And, one of the things that you've heard in the news just a lot the last few days is, whether or not we should be having more of a focus on as of right planning. It's just absolutely crystal clear. You have a right to build a fourplex on a particular site, yay or nay. It certainly gets rid of the debating society component of it if you have really clear rules. And so I think what the planner from Markham was talking about was more, yeah, let's have these clear rules. Let's streamline the process so there's less to go through. And so I think they were both right. I think whatever's left, whatever's streamlined, you need to bring your A game to that and work through it as best as you can. But we're not done with the process of making the process more streamlined. And I think it's to the government's credit that they've tried different efforts to try to streamline it lately. I think it's to their discredit that some of them have been starts and stops. And I think we're probably looking at another round of change coming again. And one of the big themes that I hear is change exhaustion. There's just been so much change that how can you expect anybody to be working effectively in a streamlined system when the system's changing as frequently as it is? And so that's something that, again, all those players and all those stakeholders in that room have to navigate.
We're chatting tonight about housing and the Urban Land Institute dinner that Sabine Matheson chaired a panel discussion on what's going on in planning and in housing in the Greater Toronto Area just a couple of weeks ago. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Sabine in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A real pleasure of mine to meet and introduce you today to Sabine Matheson. We're talking about housing. Sabine was the moderator of a Urban Land Institute dinner where all the people in the development industry, construction industry, politicians, etc., got to sit down with a different planner from one different city or town in the Greater Toronto Area at their table, and then hear a panel discussion that Sabine moderated with a couple of chief planners from around the region on what's going right, what's going wrong with housing today. Sabine, you mentioned that one of the other issues was infrastructure. And it was interesting because the chief planner from Hamilton sort of focused on that. And he was saying that he thought too much of the focus of infrastructure and of density was in the city of Toronto. And he was arguing that we needed to invest in other parts of the Greater Toronto Area region, and that Hamilton, obviously has been one of the places that with maybe cheaper land and new infrastructure that's been put in there, it's been a great place to build housing and provide an alternative to the high housing costs in Toronto. What do you think about that issue, about that infrastructure and density should not just be focused on downtown Toronto, but should be spread out around the region? Is that the right strategy, or no, you want the density downtown Toronto?
I think you want both. I think, firstly, the Hammer, if you haven't been out there lately, it's amazing. Not just what they're doing, but what they're planning on doing. I mean, it's every time I go there, I feel like I'm kind of watching Toronto's Brooklyn coming along. Like I feel like it's a really vibrant place, and it's the best years are ahead for Hamilton. But the province has tried to put a real focus on having nodes of growth anywhere where there's a significant transit capacity. So, basically significant GO stations or places like that. And so, I think there's a fairly high degree of alignment that there needs to be housing investment that's linked to the investments in transportation, and that we're trying to get the most out of our transportation by making sure that we build intensely along those corridors. I'll tell you what nobody likes. And I'm just sort of stunned. If you drive along the Danforth or go for a walk along the Danforth in Toronto, there are still places there on top of subway stations where you have massively underutilized corners. You know, like if the corner at Greenwood, I haven't been there in a while, so it could be all under development now. But 60 or 70 years after the Danforth line was created, I remember when I used to hang out there more often 10 years ago. You had one two-story Bank of Nova Scotia at one corner. You had a decrepit former gas station parking lot on the other. On another one, you had a classic two-story retail, dry cleaner on the ground floor, two apartments above, and a derelict movie theater at that corner. And I may not be doing it justice, but it's nothing like what you'd expect on top of the most significant transit investment that we have decades after it had been made. And at the same time, it's almost like the policy was, well, we're going to protect our existing neighborhoods to such a high degree that even though they're served with high order transit, well, to heck with them. The new folks that are coming, they can take the bus and they can go up to Steeles and Shepherd. That's where we're going to put the high density, and we're just going to protect with restrictive rules. We're going to protect these restrictive neighborhoods, even though, or these established neighborhoods, even though they have enormous capital investments in them. And so it's partly where do you put the capital investments, like Steve Robichaud from Hamilton was saying, but it's also how you use them once you have them. And I think one really positive thing is with the province's focus on major transit station areas and these transit-oriented communities, we are getting the appropriate alignment between the expectation of where we're putting these investments. There ought to be the density of people who are going to use those investments, just to make them convenient. Like where do you think you'd put people except adjacent to these transit stations? And then to also make the transit lines more successful and get people out of their cars. So like, I think that's a positive thing that we've got a lot of alignment on now.
Well, it's a positive thing. It really hasn't happened, has it? There's been talk about this major transit station area policy for a year now, and it still hasn't been announced. And it's interesting that in BC, what they've done is they've come out and almost, not quite, but almost to your comment about as of right zoning, they've almost made it an as of right zoning to get 12 stories if you're within 400 meters of not only a major transit station, but a bus station exchange, bus route exchange. What do you think about that? Should there be as of right zoning of significant density or height at transit stations? And to take that, a step farther, if I could, Jennifer Keesmaat, former chief planner, city planner for the city of Toronto, was on my show once, and she said the biggest mistake we made in Toronto was not putting zoning along Danforth and Bloor like we did on Yonge Street. So, it is an issue. How do we get those developments to take place along Bloor and Danforth?
Well, look, you're right that we still have issues around actually sealing the deal on making these things move. I just tend to be on the optimistic side with them. I think it's in a way better space than it was in terms of consensus that it needs to go ahead. But yeah, if it were me, I'd be doing more as of right, particularly for purpose-built rental, because we have such a shortage of purpose-built rental, and that really is essential to the broader housing market. So, really it's about having the infrastructure we need and then optimizing it once we have it. And as long as we move in that direction, I think, we'll hit the target of that we were trying to talk about on at that dinner of how will when we're looking back in 10 years, if we've succeeded, what kind of things will we have achieved? Well, we will definitely not be talking about MTSAs. We will be delivering MTSAs, to your point.
There has been, as you mentioned, this conversation recently about the as of right of being able to build a fourplex, and the federal government now looks like they're making an announcement that you won't get money if you don't actually change your rules such that you can demand that. And then Ford, the Premier of Ontario, said that people are against it, that they will rise up against having fourplexes in their neighborhoods. What do you think is as of right to convert every single family home across the whole GTA into a fourplex a positive, or is there going to be a ton of opposition to it?
Well, both of those things could be true. There could be a ton of opposition to it, but it could still be positive from a point of view of where we need to go. And so, as is so often the case, I find very rarely is anybody absolutely dead wrong about anything. Like usually if somebody's got a burr in their saddle on something, it's because they have some kernel of a point. The question isn't, are they totally wrong? The question is, okay, well, given that there's a point here and a point there, which way am I going to go? Because, to govern is to choose. And I honestly believe that fourplexes are like, I wouldn't fight one that was in my neighborhood. I recently had a person build a massive house next to mine. Mine is pretty big anyway. You know, we reached an accommodation about how to accommodate each other. His is 3 stories tall. It could easily have been a fourplex. Like I actually think we have to get over ourselves a little bit in one important way, which is I know that your house is your most important investment. And I know that your brother-in-law is going to probably come over and look at you funny if you're not opposing something that's going up next to you. But you kind of have to say, yeah, well, I've got my place and other people have got to have theirs. And a community is about making space. And, you kind of have to live by, you have to live by the values that allow a community to thrive. And I think one of them is we have to remake ourselves from a place that was built largely as single family dwellings that were kind of sprawly. And we have to intensify. That's just the way it is if we're going to manage the combination of the environmental impacts of our growth and the need to accommodate people. So like it takes a higher degree of difficulty in terms of how we get along, but I think it's necessary and I think it's the way of the future. But the premier's right. It's going to annoy some people. I don't think they will rise up. I don't think there will be the equivalent of a January 6th insurrection if we have fourplexes in Ontario. I'm not expecting to see a guy wearing a helmet with horns on it fighting this anytime soon. But he's right that people get their backs up when they think they're protecting their financial interests and the interests of their family. I just think leadership on the point probably means taking us where we need to go, and I hope we get there.
Stats Canada came out with a report and an analysis a little while ago that said that Toronto, Victoria, Vancouver were the worst places in the Western world for approval time period for housing. The longest, the slowest, more regulation. And one of the ways that the provincial government has combated that is with the use of MZOs, ministerial zoning orders, which really has overridden local democracy completely and just said, this is what we think is right. What do you think about the use of MZOs? Is that smart or not?
Well, again, is it smart? It depends on what you're doing it for. There are times when MZOs, I think, make a lot of sense. I mean, the reason they were created in the first place was where there's such a web of complexity that there's kind of no way to get from here to there. And that's the whole red tape problem of, I was involved in one time that was really complex. It required a municipal boundary change and a significant change of use and the comprehensive rezoning of the lands and it was all part of a settlement of an ongoing legal dispute and the whole thing was like it wasn't just a chicken and the egg problem. It was a chicken and the egg and 3 other states of being. Like it was like a giant 6-way puzzle, and there was no way to use the existing tools to do it. And so the MZO in that circumstance was really good. I think there's other times when MZOs can be useful if it's about achieving a particularly beneficial type of infrastructure, and there's just we just kind of get on with it. I mean, I'm a real student of history, and I remember that in World War II, C.D. Howe and other great industrialists became dollar-a-year men for the government. And they were told, hey, like we need 1,000 new Lancaster bombers by next Tuesday to get it done. And they got it done and they put out what they called a wartime effort to do what we needed to do to mobilize our society to achieve what we need to achieve. And that was an instance of everybody pulling in the same direction. And, I'm sure at the time they didn't spend a lot of time doing environmental assessments because they were worried about winning a war. And I'm not saying that we should run our development system that way, but when we really care to get something done, we get it done. And, you know, if there's people who are homeless, if there's people who can't afford a place to live, if there's a whole generation of people my daughter's age who are worried about not being able to get a house, you know, I know it's not a war, but it's pretty damn important.
I think
And
it's a I think it's a crisis. I think it is the
yeah,
crisis. If climate change is the crisis of our generation, I think that housing affordability is the crisis of the next few years, and we've got to solve it. I really do. We got to take a
exactly.
break though for some messages, and we're going to come back with Sabine Matheson, talk more about social housing, about affordability, about some of the other issues that came out of that dinner, and that Sabine, I apologize, has been chatting about in some of her most recent talks, moderations of speeches and panels and posts that she's done on social media. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Sabine Matheson. She's general counsel and a partner at Strategy Corp. It's a big strategy consulting firm downtown Toronto that specializes, I think, in government, municipal, provincial issues and strategy. I knew one of the other principals who regrettably passed away quite well because I ended up working with him on a bunch of transit ideas at one point in time about a decade ago, and he was brilliant. And so I've got to tell you, I've had some interaction with your firm in the past, and I've been really quite impressed with all the people I've met. So thank you again for joining us. Sabine, we've been talking about housing. We've been talking about as of rights for fourplexes. We've been talking about regulation and red tape and things like that. One of the other issues that you've spoken about is social housing. And, you know, I think Olivia Chow, the new mayor of Toronto, has really been focusing on social housing. You know, our previous conversation was really more about sort of the general level of affordability, but affordability for people at the lower ends of the income spectrum, you know, is pretty key. I think this has got issues of homelessness associated with it. There's issues of whether housing is a right. I interviewed one person who told me that it's cheaper to house people than it is to leave them homeless. And so therefore the federal government's, you know, exiting the social housing sector back a couple decades ago, this person thought was a huge mistake, both from a societal standpoint, but also from just a purely economics standpoint. What do you think? You said you did a survey and you spoke at this conference. Where do you come out on this issue?
Well, look, this is a really interesting topic. And just before, I just want to thank you for mentioning the passing of John Duffy. He was a great friend and colleague for 23 years, and he is certainly very much missed. But he cared a lot about this issue too. So let me just dive right in. You're right. We did do a survey of 20 CEOs of public housing entities in Ontario. And we wanted to listen to them and get a sense of what the number one issues were on their mind. And the one finding that really stood out for me was that when they started, most of them in their careers, they would think about the acuity of the need of the people who they served. And they said that the biggest change is that over time, they might have had a small percentage of people in their units who needed high levels of support. But the assumption was that most of them had a financial problem, but that they were capable of independent living. And the big thing that they were telling us was there's been a material change in the challenges that the people who they serve face, and that many of them are considerably more needful of support, and that in many cases, the buildings weren't designed in a way to optimize the needs of people in that situation. And so they said that it'd be a real mistake to think about the populations who they serve as being the same as they were. There's a lot more mental health issues. There's a lot more drug addiction, and there's deeper poverty. And so for entities that were set up predominantly to just provide the bricks and mortar of a house, they say that used to be the whole job. You were really just helping make it more affordable for them. Now it's increasingly half the job. And that's one of the huge challenges. And so the point that you made a minute ago, I think is dead on. It's absolutely essential that we understand a kind of a continuum of housing need, And that when we see people who are experiencing homelessness, when we think about the kinds of supports they need to transition from homelessness into more stable housing, and then kind of get people up the curve towards, a better life, better outcomes, that there's a whole variety of steps that we need on the ladder. And, there's another type of work that I do in community safety and well-being plans. And these are really interesting plans that bring together people from the policing side of things, the housing side of things, the health care, like primary care, and also like the more expensive hospital care. And it's designed to kind of drag all these people together and get them out of their silos and into one place. And it became a requirement to do one of these strategies. It came out of the Ministry of the Solicitor General, and all municipalities are required to have one. And it forces all kinds of people who don't normally report up the same chain of command, and they don't have the same budget structures, and they don't have the same accountabilities, and they don't have the same mission, and they use different tools, some wear blue uniforms, some wear white coats. But it's forcing them all to work together and put the people who they serve more at the center of things. And what they all say, and the whole theory behind this, is it's no more complicated than an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so if you can intervene before people have a problem, it's not just better for them, it's cheaper. Because the most expensive and least productive thing is to sit by till a person gets into real trouble, whether it be healthcare trouble or law trouble or poverty trouble, and then have to dig them out of a profoundly deep hole after they've, either harmed their health or put themselves into a real deep bad spot in regard to their social relationships or what have you. So, what everybody who's looking at this, they all say the same thing. Boy, if only we had the resources to intervene earlier, the people who we serve would be happier and it would be cheaper. And I, as an old red Tory, that's extremely attractive to me, because like the two things that are most important to me are tending to the bottom line and making sure that when we spend stuff, we're thinking about future generations and not borrowing against our children's future. But it's then, the reason we save money and the reason we do better is so we can invest it on the people around us who need stuff. So I find that whole approach personally very attractive.
You may know the numbers, and I have not checked into the numbers, but I was at a presentation, real estate forum for developers, where one of the speakers was from a homelessness organization, and he said it was almost 10 times cheaper to actually house people than it was to leave them homeless. It would cost about $100,000, he said, to house people, but $500 to $1 million to allow them to be on the streets because of their use of emergency wards, first responders, doctors, physicians, police, the criminal justice system, drug injection sites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the comment was made that the vast majority, and I don't know if he actually it's quoted a statistic, but he said the vast majority of homeless people have either mental health issues or drug addiction issues or both, and that therefore, until and unless we dealt with those two issues, we weren't going to deal with the homeless issue.
That's absolutely correct as far as I know the numbers to be. And, if you were to go to a meeting of the Ontario Big City Mayors, who I'm very proud to be their strategic advisor. Their chair, Mayor Marion Mead Ward from Burlington, and previous chairs like Cam Guthrie, another fine former mayor named Crombie. They've all been like leading the charge on saying, we're the mayors at the front line who experience this every day. And the public, they see disorder in the downtown. And, they call the mayor and they say, do something about it. And the mayor calls the mayor's staff and says, well, what do I have in the toolbox to deal with this? And the answer you get is like watching at one of those road sign posts that points in 50 different directions. Well, for this, you got to call health. And for that, you got to call police. And for that, you got to call welfare. And for that, you got to call housing. And it's all different chains of command, all different accountabilities, all different logic. Somebody saves $1 over here and, oh, well, that's on your budget. That's not on mine. the more we can integrate this kind of thinking and put the person at the center of the person who we serve at the center of it and get them what we need, it's dollars better spent. And so, like, to me, that is like very, very conservative thinking, to A, be helpful to people for what they need, and B, be really efficient when you do it. And so, just like red tape in housing drives me crazy, red tape in human support drives me crazy too. I
Well,
love
you said
I
you
love
were a
your
red
question.
Tory. I interviewed Dalton Camp, and he was a proponent of a guaranteed annual income, and he believed that if you treated people like kids, and made them go to a whole bunch of different places to get approvals for some of the social services monies that government had allotted to them, and disciplined them and checked up on them and did all the things that sometimes parents do to kids, they would act like kids and not make adult decisions. But that if you give them a guaranteed annual income, they would actually make smart decisions. Vancouver did an interesting study where people were given a full year's allotment of the full gamut of the different um, monies that they would have received from government at one time, and it was a couple thousand dollars. I think it was $9,000 that they ended up being given. And something like 70-80% of them actually made smart decisions that changed their lives, either by going back to school or by getting a job or taking some training or getting a rental apartment or something. And that therefore, the idea being that if you kept people on a tight rope and gave them a little bit of money every week or every month, and treated them like a kid that they couldn't make smart decisions, they acted like a kid and didn't make smart decisions. But if you treated them like an adult and gave them a chunk of money, not all of them, but a lot of them actually made smart decisions and acted like an adult. What do you think of Dalton?
Well, you know what?
Yeah.
He was a great human being in a lot of ways, and I'm kind of attracted to that too. As you know, there was a couple of pilot programs that were going about a guaranteed annual income late in the last provincial government, and the current government moved away from those. But I think we may well find we need to move back to that. But the great thing is we're a lot better at doing, like, for all the trouble that we are a lot better at doing public policy than we used to be. And the great thing about a few pilot programs is you can see how they work before you open the floodgates on everything. And I would certainly be supportive of anybody who said they wanted to try some further pilots on that to figure out how to do it well. Because, the one thing we can all agree on is no one wants to do anything badly. And I don't love the way we do things now. And I don't love the way we do things now so much that I wouldn't be prepared to make sensible investments in trying to do them better.
I got to ask you, if I could, in 1995 to 1998, you were the chief of staff to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing in the provincial government. And some major projects were looked at the time, such as the amalgamation of the City of Toronto, the reform of the Municipal Act, the Planning Act, the rent control system, and the property tax system. In 1996, Ann Golden chaired a task force called the GTA Task Force that recommended a bunch of different things for the GTA. And it said that collaboration and coordination were key, and recommended the amalgamation of Toronto, but also, more coordination around the whole GTA. The only thing that was enacted by the government at the time was the amalgamation of Toronto. What do you think is the right strategy? Number one, was amalgamation the right decision? And number two, what do you think the right strategy is for governing the Greater Toronto Area?
First, I'll say sometime have me back for another hour and I'll tell you all about this because it's one of my favorite subjects. But quickly, yes, amalgamation was the right thing. In regard to Ann Golden, it was a great report. I think I was the first person outside of the task force to read it, or one of the very early ones. And so it was a real privilege to see their thinking early on. And they were very influential to us. We actually did create the Greater Toronto Services Board, but it only lasted for a couple of years. And at the time, Toronto and the 905 were in sort of a structural conflict position. And unfortunately, the province had basically used up all the political capital it had on that file, and it wasn't prepared to push municipalities around anymore at that time, because it had been doing it so much a couple of years before. Honestly, it was kind of like they exhausted their will to push around municipalities and provide a lot of centralized leadership. And so the effort to have the Greater Toronto Services Board be the thing that would bind together and cause the collaboration that Ann Golden and her team were looking at, it lived for 4 years. It was too weak. And then when the McGuinty government came in, they put in place the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which was a different way of achieving the same thing. It was, instead of it being bottom-up municipal governance working together, this was the imposition of provincial policy leadership on the municipalities. And that kind of had a pretty good run. That's been the law of the province for a long time. Now, the Ford government has decided that there were aspects of that should evolve and change some of the rules under it. So, I would say in a way, the Golden Report was perhaps more influential than it's given credit, because I think it did get implemented, just not in the way that they recommended. And, right now, there's people to this day who still say what we need is a GTHA governance structure. I think the problem with that is always going to be, by the time it's that big, I think I started off at the start of the interview saying it's really difficult to have one size fits all policies that work for the diversity that is the GTHA. And the problem is, like the old proverb of many people who are visually impaired trying to describe an elephant, and one saying it's rough and kind of puffy, and one saying it's kind of pointy and hard. And the truth is they're all right, but they're looking at different pieces of it. And I think that's very much the situation when you get into the GTHA. Yeah, I would definitely have done the amalgamation of the city of Toronto again. I think when you look at how that worked out at the time, the reason the premier did it, it's really fascinating. He had just gone to Japan for one of those, trade missions that people go on. And he had met with a whole bunch of Japanese businessmen, and through the interpreters, he was saying, well, yes, I'm Premier of Ontario. And he tells the story that they all looked at him completely puzzled and said, Ontario, like, is that anywhere near Toronto? And if you think about it, I have no idea what subnational jurisdiction Tokyo is in. But there's been a lot of scholars over the years who've made the point that today our economy is made up of global building blocks, and those global building blocks are cities. And so you need a strong anchor city. And at the time, we had fairly goofy competition going on between North York and Toronto, and East York and York were a basket case, and financially, and Scarborough wasn't a whole lot better. So it made sense to consolidate the whole thing. And while it's had its problems, I just believe it's better than the alternative. It's never going to be easy running a community of that size that's got the challenge that it's got. But I think coordinating it through one central entity was better than having it coordinated through 6 entities plus a regional government.
I interviewed Joe Barrich of Urban Strategies, and he said the problem we've got is we're not thinking about what Toronto is today and in the future. He says Toronto today is the 4th largest city in North America, the 3rd largest city in Canada, United States, Mexico City, New York, Los Angeles, and then Toronto, bigger than Chicago, greater than Greater Dallas, etc., stretching from Oshawa to Waterloo and Niagara Falls in contiguous metropolitan area of 10 million people, and growing, and will be growing even further. It's the economic engine of Canada. And he says no one is thinking about that on a consolidated basis and has the vision for how we're going to operate and grow and be dynamic. And he said, these mayors and chairs that are 29 mayors and chairs that get together is the wrong way to do it. We've got to have a better governance system. He said effectively the premier or the minister of municipal affairs is the mayor of the Greater Toronto Area. And that's wrong, because we should have someone that is thinking about that. And it's transit, it's sewage, it's planning, it's transportation, it's traffic, it's highways, it's a whole bunch of things. It's not everything, because everything, lots of other things should be done on a smaller basis, but it's a lot of the big things. And he said, we need a vision for the Greater Toronto Area. And he said, New York has a vision. Greater Los Angeles has a vision. Denver got together and has a vision. What do you think about it? Is he right or is he wrong?
No, I think he's right. I'm not sure that the way to do it is by having one government, but the weird thing about getting older is you can start to see how things have evolved over time. And I would urge anybody who says, boy, why does Toronto have an obsession about being a world-class city? And there's this dreadful thing that was created for the centennial at Expo, and it's called Copter Canada. And I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. If you look at it, oh my goodness, does it ever show how picayune we were in 1967. And like one of the horrible things about it is it was meant to be a 45-minute piece about the whole country of Canada. They take about the first 35 minutes to just get about as far as Toronto, and then they say, oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff west of that too. And it's this great footage. They obviously had a lot of fun flying around the country in a helicopter, but they seem to take a lot of pictures of guys in red coats at historic sites as if those were the most important things to look at in our cities. And when they fly over Toronto, it looks like Regina still does. You know, parking lot, low rise, parking lot, and then City Hall. And you say, okay, this place was so early in its evolution in 1967, and people were still going to Buffalo on the weekends. I now understand why people like Paul Godfrey and Alan Tonks and all those names from the 80s were so obsessed about putting lipstick on the city. Like it needed a lot of growth and a lot of help. And so here we are, you know, 30, 40 years later, and it's better. And actually, in some ways, it's great. But we've not found our footing. And so it's that vision piece that Joe Barrage is getting at that I do think is missing. The real problem is in the temper of our times with our politics. It's easier for mayors to score points off each other than it is to have a common vision. And I do agree with you that if you wait for the province to provide that vision, you don't always get it. I think one of the most unexpected positive things I've seen in the last 6 months, though, was the coming together of the Premier and the Mayor of Toronto around a new financial deal for Toronto. Because honestly, if you said before they got together and come up with that, and you said, hey, they're going to work for a couple of months, what do you think the results of that are going to be? And I got to tell you, you could have knocked me over with a feather that they made as much progress as they did. And I think that's the sign of two people who just made a decision to make it work, and probably a lot of very good staff reports. And if I do say so myself, I had a hand in writing the long-term financial plan for the city of Toronto that became some of the foundation of that work. And so I think you know, if you have common building blocks around the facts, then it's a lot easier to say, what are we going to build with these building blocks? And so, you know, I think that helped. But really, there's no replacing the leadership of the Premier and the Mayor actually coming together to deal with the needs of the community. So I'm not sure that governance is going to be the solution, but I do agree that we got to come up with something. Having a bit more swagger, a bit more of a vision would really help.
A bit more swagger, a little bit more vision. Sounds idealistic, but I think it's what we need. Sabine Matheson is our guest tonight. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've had a really interesting conversation tonight with Sabine Matheson. She is partner and general counsel at Strategy Corps. She was the moderator of Urban Land Institute big dinner that occurred a couple of weeks ago, where they had the planners from all the major parts of the Greater Toronto Area up on stage and in the audience talking about what we needed to do to make Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, a better place. Sabine, we've had a good conversation about some of the problems and some of the solutions. We talked about red tape and regulation. We talked about change. I got to ask you, is government and the leadership in government, I think it was Ronald Reagan that said it, the problem or the solution? Is government the problem, or can it actually benefit society here in Toronto?
Well, you know, that's a great question. I think it's both. And so I'll say what I think is going well. I think there's all kinds of creativity that's being applied at all levels of government to our challenges. What I think is going wrong is whenever I hear that the feds are fighting with the province, or that the municipalities are fighting with the province, or, you know, any combination thereof, I always say to myself, you know, this is partly because there's too much change, and it's partly because there's not enough. And I know what you're going to say. You say, well, how do we know which is which? And you know, I think that just at some degree there is a need to get the fundamentals right, and then you have to let it heal, and you have to let people get on and do their work. And I think right now we're at a moment where the pace of change has exceeded the benefit of change. And so the faster they settle this down, and like, I really don't want to see a fight about as of right fourplexes, yay or nay, chew up the next year and a half between the feds and the province. Like, figure it out, get her done, and move on, because all of these initiatives that disrupt things are a problem. And what we need to do is just let developers, let builders, let planners work within a system that's stable long enough to get something done. Because every time they undo decisions and backtrack and do that kind of thing, all it does is chew up more clock. And really, we don't have the time. We need to get on with it.
I agree with you, but at the same time, I wonder about the benefit of the typical change in companies we talk about is getting everyone on board and buying in. A couple of weeks ago was the funeral of Brian Mulroney, and you were involved in politics, so you must have known him and followed him closely. Free trade, there were 26 volumes of the MacDonald Royal Commission that was started by the Liberal government and finished under his government. And then we fought an election campaign, and it was a pretty big election campaign with John Turner saying, you're selling out Canada, the United States, and Mulroney saying this is the right thing for, the prosperity of Canada. And the decision was made. Mulroney won, and free trade was implemented, and it's changed Canada for the better. A couple years later, I don't know all the facts here, but I think GST, which I believe was one of the smartest things ever got done from a fiscal standpoint, was implemented without a campaign, without a lot of study, and if the study was done, it was kept reasonably secret. There wasn't and he went down to the biggest defeat in Canadian history, such that Charest in his eulogy said it was the least popular policy at the time, but the most popular by all of his successors. There's some benefit to having a really good discussion and even fighting an election over a policy issue that's going to be dramatic and changing things, is there not?
Okay, so no, I do agree with you there. What I just don't like is the constant one step forward, one step back kind of stuff. It's if you think about it, it's common to hear people say, oh, well, we're going into pre-election mode. The government won't do anything until for a year. And then you hear, oh, they're in honeymoon mode. They won't do anything because they're just figuring out where the bathrooms are. And frankly, if we waste the last year and the first year of every 4-year governing cycle, then we're governing 2 years out of 4. And, that's kind of rough math, but we can't afford that. But it gets even worse if one government's going into pre-election mode when the other one's coming out of it, because if they're staggered and they have to work together, because like if you were to align the election cycles of the 3 levels of government, you'd say, wow, look at that. One of the 3 has been in lame duck pre-election mode, 6 to 9 months, 12 months or so out of each of the last 24, 36 months. Like, how do we get anything done? Exactly. So somewhere between a knock them down, drag them out, fight, settle it, get on with it, move forward, versus the constant move forward, nattering, and all that kind of thing that never leads anywhere. That is that's the challenge. And one of the scary prospects of creating GTHA governance is you create something that would be big enough and powerful enough and scary enough that it'd almost rival the province in its ability to get things done. So I think that's a kind of a big, be careful what you wish for. But, my wish for all of us is honestly that we get some policy stability and have a good run of the next couple of years getting stuff done, because it could be that we don't need so much new ideas as we need time to implement the ideas that we have.
I sat down with Hazel McCallion, the former mayor of Mississauga, at one point in time, and we talked about the right way to govern the Greater Toronto Area. And she thought that some sort of GTHA organization made sense. But she said, number one, no one's got the political, and she used a colloquial balls, which I think is really political courage. But she said political balls to do it because the local communities would be up in arms against it, even though it was the right thing to do and would have great efficiency. So she said that's not going to happen. And she said the second thing is whoever was leading that organization, whether it was a GTH chair or a mayor or something like that, would be more powerful than the premier. So the premier would never let it happen.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And when we did have one in the Greater Toronto Services Board, she basically led the charge from the 905 attack in Toronto all the time. And Toronto kind of opted out of that forum. They didn't send Mel Lastman. They sent a very fine fellow who was the deputy mayor for a long time named Case Otis. And he would attend those meetings. And watching Hazel attack Case Otis was like watching paint dry on the wall. Because, Hazel was angry and you couldn't get a rise out of Case. if nuclear war had just been declared. He was just so calm. And it was almost like a giant delaying exercise for 4 years until people said, let's cancel this due to lack of interest. So, she knew what she was talking about because she actually worked at a table that tried to make that work, and it was a failure. And one of the reasons it was a failure was because it wasn't really given the mandate or the power that it would have needed to be a real scary place. So instead, it just became a debating society. But that's ancient history. The last point I just make is I think, like, vision attracts resources, right? You were talking about vision and Joe Barrage's point that we need to have more vision. Vision attracts resources. So if you have the vision of something you're trying to achieve and the credibility that you could deliver it, then that's when people are prepared to say, okay, I'm going to use some of my political capital to get you what you need to implement it. That is the number one determinant of when we get stuff done. And, Brian Mulroney always used to say, I believe in big Canada, and the people who are afraid of free trade, they worry about little Canada. But I believe in having great dreams about what we can be, not great fears about we can never be, or, stuff like that. And, he was somebody who had a great vision. I mean, you're right. I was a big supporter of his. And I think I have described myself as a fangirl of Brian Mulroney, akin to, best understood by people of our generation of being like a 14-year-old girl at a Donny Osmond concert back in the 1970s. And I own that. I thought he was great.
Or a 14-year-old girl, or even me at a Taylor Swift concert. Unbelievable.
Well, yeah. I'm older than that now, but I feel the same.
Sabine Matheson, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Hope to talk to you again.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from downtown Toronto at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are posted the second that my radio show goes to air. I post on social media and on all those podcast outlets. See you tomorrow. Good night, everybody.